We're in a recession. I mean, it's not coming. We're in it. It's a triple, greatest bubble of all time, times three, in the sense that it's real estate, stocks, and other asset classes. The largest, most sophisticated, biggest player, real money market in the world is telling you that the Fed's going to blink, that they're going to raise rates, and then things are going to get so bad, they're going to have to cut rates. And that's why we can see a liquidity crisis and a very severe recession coming well in advance. I haven't really seen the market collapse, stock market collapse that I would expect in association with a severe recession has not happened yet. This is just going to play out. It'll get worse as the year goes on. Inflation was going up long before the war in Ukraine started. So if everything is great until February 27th, and then Russia invades, and then all of a sudden the inflation goes up. All right, let's talk about it. But that's not true. This inflation goes back to late 2021. It was persistent in the fall. We all remember the Fed and the Treasury saying transitory, 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 and then finally, I think Jay Powell was testifying before Congress. He said it's time to retire the word transitory. So that was his way of throwing in the towel. And Janet Yellen admitted she was mistaken also. This is going to be part of what throws the economy into severe recession. They're raising rates and inflation is coming down. But what they don't know is, are interest rates coming down because they're raising rates, or have they already hit the terminal rate and it's coming down on its own and they just don't know it? And that's a big deal, because if they're at the terminal rate and they just don't know it and they keep tightening, which they are going to over tighten, probably already have. The energy prices are going up because there's a war with Russia. Well, I wonder why that is. Well, the reason is not because Putin invaded Ukraine, it's because the U.S. counterattacked with financial sanctions. Now, bear in mind, go back to January 21st, 2021, when Biden was sworn in as president, and then went back to the White House. What was the first thing he did? He closed the Keystone XL pipeline. This is a pipeline that would bring oil from Alberta, Canada, into the United States, where it would connect at a hub. I believe it's in Kansas, but somewhere in the central United States. And then the hub distributes it to the entire country. So he shut down that pipeline, which curtailed the supply of oil from Canada. And then we end up with oil prices doubling or tripling, really, from $40 to $120 in under a year. The other source of inflation is on the demand side. So you have what's called cost push inflation. That's where supplies choked off, or there's an embargo, or there's a shortage, natural disaster, a lot of things. It's coming from the supply side, and demand is inelastic, so you just pay up or kind of do without. But the demand side is much more psychological. That's called demand pull inflation. That's when consumers behave the way I described, and as I say, I lived through the 70s, where hey, I better buy it today, I better buy it now. You're pulling all this demand forward and bidding up prices because you're worried that it's going to get even worse. So inflation is coming down, no question. But is it because the Fed has continued to raise rates, or is it because the Fed has hit a terminal rate and all they have to do is nothing, just pause, as they put it, and inflation will come down where they want? The market believes we're at the terminal rate. The Fed should just stop right now, leave it alone. Sooner than later pivot to, that's the new buzzword, pivot to rate cuts. And it's the anticipation of those rate cuts that has Wall Street all spun up. They get the pom-poms out and saying, buy stocks, buy tech, because the Fed's going to cut rates. The Fed does not see it that way at all. The Fed says, yeah, we're raising rates, inflation's coming down, but we're not at the terminal rate. We'll kind of know when we see it, but they think it's probably 5.25. That's a very good estimate based on what the Fed has said themselves. I started my career in banking in 1976, and so I remember my wife and I used to kid each other. She was in advertising, I was in banking, and the inflation was so bad, you'd get a raise every 4 or 5 months, and you didn't have to ask. They would just give it to you because they knew that you were going to quit if they didn't keep up. So she would get a raise, and she was making more than I was at the time. So we'd go out to dinner, and then I would get a raise, and I was making more than she was. So we would just tease each other about that. But that's how it was. And the psychology was, if you needed whatever, a TV set or refrigerator, new car, whatever, you say, I better buy it now because the price is going to be higher. If I wait a month or 2 months, the price is going to run away from me. So it had huge behavioral effects. Between 77 and 81, so that 5-year period, the dollar lost 50% of its purchasing power, not 15, 50. During the first part of the Great Depression, unemployment was high, output was dropping, trade was dropping. It was a very, very bad time, no doubt about it. But not everybody was out of work. Not everybody was poor. There were a lot of people with a lot of money at the time, but it was felt that being ostentatious was poor form. It's like, okay, I'm lucky I have a job, I've got some money, but I'm not going to buy a new car, buy a big house, or flash it around or whatever, because it's really not considerate of all the people who actually have fallen on hard times. Well, that was the narrative, but it's the worst possible economic advice, because it's precisely the fact that people with the money should keep spending that kind of can boost the economy out of a depression. So by people saying, well, even though I have the money, I'm not going to spend it because it's poor form, we're actually prolonging the Great Depression. Today, we are starting with the cost push inflation, mainly the price of energy, but the price of food is a big factor. And of course, they're related. It's like, here's the energy, here's the food. Where do you think the food comes from? To get the food, you got to feed the pigs and cows. What do you feed them? You feed them corn. How do you get corn? Well, you grow it on a farm. You need nitrogen fertilizer. You need diesel in your tractors. You get the food, you got to put it in a truck to get it from point A to point B. That requires diesel. The higher the diesel price, the higher the cost of food, because you're moving it by truck, etc. So these things, as I say, are linked. But food prices are going up substantially, and the two things you can't do without are gas in the car and food. So you have that cost push inflation. We're not quite at the stage where it's demand pull. We're not quite at the stage where individual consumers are behaving the way I described in the 1970s, saying, hey, better spend the money fast because it's losing value. This damage was self-inflicted, but don't be misled by the headlines, because they're, again, this narrative, but they're not actually doing it. So the point being, the price increase and the inflation in the U.S. has very little to do with Putin and everything to do with the U.S. handicapping its own energy industry, begging dictators for oil, and the influence of the climate alarmists. And by the way, that whole crowd want higher gas prices. They want gas to be $7, $8, $9 a gallon, because they expect that will accelerate the transfer to electric vehicles and make the electric vehicle more attractive relative to the internal combustion engine. Now, that's another fantasy. It will never happen. But meanwhile, they're destroying the U.S. economy in pursuit of an ideological point that will never actually happen.